Welcome everyone. We'll give it about one more minute to let people join in before we begin. And I'll go ahead and start. Hello and welcome. Today is part 3 in our 4-part Tech Trends series brought to you by the ACG Silicon Valley, Austin, San Antonio, and San Francisco chapters jointly. We're very excited to be presenting today's program, Rising Tech Stars, moderated by Jason Avila, partner in charge technology at Weaver, with guest speakers Bina Amanath, Executive Director at Deloitte Global, AI Institute and AI Ethics Lead, and Ted Smith, Chief Operating Officer at Nuvi Corporation. The final program in this series will be held on June 10th, so we will hopefully have a registration in the chat for you. But yeah, register when you get a chance. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to thank the following sponsors of SF Chapter and the gracious sponsors of the Austin San Antonio Chapter and our fantastic sponsors of the Silicon Valley Chapter who make all our programs possible. We are very grateful. And okay, a couple housekeeping notes. Please, when you join, mute yourself and turn off your video during the program and direct all questions to chat, or at the conclusion of the program, we can open up a video and audio for you to ask your questions as well. And join us at the end for the networking portion where you can turn on video and audio and we'll move into small breakout rooms. Right now, I'll hand it over to Jason.
Thanks, Tyler. Appreciate it. Thanks for the ACG chapters for having us, and thanks for our 2 panelists joining us today. As you mentioned, my name is Jason Avila. I'm a partner here at Weaver. I also head up our technology industry for Weaver as well. Weaver is a 70-year-old CPA firm. We are a full-service accounting firm offering your traditional assurance, tax, and advisory services. So risk, IT advisory, forensics, litigation, energy compliance, the list goes on and on. So again, thanks for having us and thanks for our guests as well joining us today. Ted and Bina, do you mind introducing yourselves? And maybe we'll start with Ted first.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'm Ted Smith. I'm the president and COO of Nuvi. Been with the company since 2010. I was its founding investor. Been on the board since then, watched the company grow through time. It's been a tremendous journey. We're now operating all over the world. We've got commercial operations going on in Europe through a strategic partnership with EDF. They're a big utility based out of France. Doing the same thing in Asia with our other strategic partner, which is Toyota Tsusho. They're the trading company for the Toyota Motors Group. Here in the United States, we're focused on the school bus segment because when electrified, those school buses are probably the best use case for our vehicle to grid technology, which allows us to aggregate those vehicles into a virtual power plant, provide services to the grid bidirectionally, and we can get paid for those services, which allows us to do some wonderful things like lower the total cost of ownership of those vehicles. We are now a public company. We went public earlier this year in March. And because we're a public company, I'm obliged to say that the views here that I express are my own. Any projections I make are for illustrative purposes only. This is not an offer or solicitation to buy or sell securities, and past performance is not indicative of future results. I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Ted. Appreciate that. Bina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Good morning and great to meet you all. And thank you for having me. My name is Bina Amanath, and I'm a technologist by training and have built my entire career anchored on data and its evolutions. So my background, right from being a hands-on database developer to leading data teams, and then building out data and AI products and solutions, taking it to market. My experience spans across different industries. I've worked at both large companies and driven their transformations, and as well as small startups. To give you an example, right from British Telecom, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, to GE, and smaller companies like E-Trade when it was a startup, and startups that don't even exist anymore, like Hello Asia and Charitable Way. I've always anchored my career on data, and as I've seen its evolution from when it was used purely for transactional purposes to then came the era of business intelligence and data warehousing, when more reports got digitized. And now we are in this era of big data and AI, which is really helping us look more into the future. At Deloitte, I lead our global Deloitte AI Institute, which is really trying to make sense of this complex AI ecosystem of startups and research, academia, use cases, bringing it all together so that companies can use AI and have a grounding in reality. I also focus on the ethics aspect because I think as a technologist, what I've seen is just as there's a lot of value that you can get from AI, and there's a lot of positive impact that you get from technologies. There's always some negative impacts that could happen if we are not thoughtful about the technology. So for me, the focus on ethics is really to address those negative impacts, and so that technology can reach its full potential. I look at ethics from different lenses, not just from the headline and awareness aspect, but really how to solve for it. How do you actually operationalize AI ethics within an organization so that you're addressing and mitigating the ethics risk early on? So that's a little bit about me, and great to be part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Beena. Yeah, I mean, I know AI is a hot topic. I mean, it's something that we continually look at, ourselves as a firm, and how does that impact our business? How does that impact our future? What does that do to workforce? So I'll start my first question with you, Beena. AI is a very broad term and gets used a lot. You having a good working experience with it and also in the different industries, how do you define AI and what do you see as AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, when I speak, I also like to kind of put out my definition of AI, because there is so much noise around it, right? And everybody has a slightly different perspective. I think about AI as a way to extend or augment human intelligence. And that's really where we are today. I think the word artificial actually gives it a connotation which doesn't really, which is not where we are today. So let me give you, let me take a step back and tell you a little bit about, the different types of AI. So, and that will help define AI. So, when we talk about, there are three different types of AI. One is artificial narrow intelligence, which is a form of AI that can do a task that any human being can do, like a very specific narrow task. That's artificial narrow intelligence. It's things like you can, AI playing chess or playing a game, or AI, translating as we speak. That's a very specific narrow task that a human being can do. Then comes the form of artificial general intelligence, which is a form of AI that can do everything that a human being can do across all the tasks, right? Like driving a car where there are different signals coming in, and you have to mitigate for each one of those. Then the third bucket is really artificial super intelligence, which is smarter than all human beings combined, and then can do more than every human being in this world, right? When we hear, in the media and the hype, a lot of it is in that third category about artificial super intelligence and, robots taking over the world and AI replacing all human jobs. That's the third category. In the real world, what it is really very much in the realm of artificial narrow intelligence, where we are looking at using AI to automate specific narrow tasks within our lives today. So for me, AI is more augmented intelligence and helping us automate narrow, boring tasks. The reality is, with all the technology that's available today with AI, the research that has been done so far, we are very much in that narrow intelligence phase, but I think our vision and our fears are very anchored on artificial super intelligence.
Thanks, Beena. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, as you look at where you see it in the technology industry today, that's where it sits. And, you know, I think we're a long ways away from the, you know, the super intelligence coming towards us. Ted, you know, how do you see AI impacting e-mobility and kind of the green tech space where you play in?
Yeah, a couple things there. First of all, Bina, I completely agree with the ethics standpoint. I mean, we're just now at the scaling point, and we can operate here in the developed world and be a good company. But if we can bring our technology to the frontier and help as a skip technology create stable grid infrastructures for frontier markets, we can be a great company. So I completely agree with that. In terms of the AI, look, we're trying to scale, and one of the things we're going to need to do is incorporate ways to forecast our resources as we scale. So if you think about it, what is Nuvi's technology? Again, we have the ability to aggregate electric vehicles into a virtual power plant, provide services to the grid bidirectionally, and get paid for them. So we are essentially doing multiple functions at the same time. And we have to be able to forecast availability of vehicles, power capacity, and historic usage of the vehicles so that we can best know what we have in order to meet the needs of the grid at any one time in a bidirectional fashion. At this point, Nuvi is the only company in the world that has this capability. And the reason is because we've been at this since, well, the technology was developed by an academic unit starting in 1996 at the University of Delaware. And so it's got decades of development and tens of millions of project funding that went into it before Nuvi came into existence in 2010. So we are essentially specialists in vehicle to grid. And so we need, as we continue to scale our technology, we need to develop ways to be able to forecast what we have, and then also to be able to match it to the grid. So when we bid into the grid, we need to have intelligence that's baked into our system that enables us to forecast, look at historical trends, look at projected values, and estimate the volatility that we're about to encounter. So these are real world instances where we are developing AI type capabilities to help with that forecasting and bidding of our resources.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks, Ted. I guess on the topic of, you know, we touched on the ethical topic, and with AI, I mean, where do you see, for both of you, where do you see the impacts in a positive light with AI? And then where do you see impacts from a negative on, you know, the different industries? Ted,
Yeah,
sorry, Bina, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to, say, if I take a step back and see where we are with these emerging technologies, right? Let's look at a higher level, right? What's going on in the world today is, whether it is AI or any of the emerging technologies, that technology is still being researched and really being developed, right? We are in no way done, where the technology is fully hardened, right? It is still very much in the academia and research world. There is new technology, that technology is still evolving with AI specifically, whether it's a next wave of deep learning or neural net or facial recognition. There is so much happening from a research perspective. The technology is evolving, and it's growing at its own pace. Then there is a second stream, which is really where the technology, which is still being under development, is being used in the real world across industries, across functions, across a multitude of use cases, because you can see value right now by using a technology which is not fully mature. So essentially, think of it as the car engine, which is still being developed. We don't, we know, you can put a wrapper around it and start driving it. And then there is a third stream that, so the second stream is exploding at its own pace, right? And then there is a third stream, which is really the impact of that technology beyond value creation, which is where things like ethics, risk, come in, because there is no, all the regulations and policies are not fully figured out. There is no playbook or on all the best practices for all the technologies that's still being developed, right? So there are all the negative impacts, the consequences of using that technology in the real world. Going back to that auto example, the speed limits have not been fully defined. How many windows should be there on the car have not yet been fully defined. Do you need seat belts? That's not. So we don't have all the guardrails put in place, because each one of these streams is growing at its own pace, and some are accelerating, sometimes it slows down. So that's why we live in this very interesting era where technology is still growing, the core technology, the applications are growing, and there are the impacts and policy or regulation which can help us make sure that we stay on and that we use ethics. I'm talking about the third stream, right? Which is the ethical implications, whether it's around bias or transparency, but also things like the health impact of using that technology, right? The addiction part that could come into play, right? How do you think about all the ways the technology could go wrong and mitigate for it is an important discussion that needs to be had, and solving for it, because at some point, otherwise we're going to have to hit the brakes on the second stream, right? And actually start pausing the application of AI across all these industries, right? Because we don't have that third part figured out yet. Is this making sense? Like, I kind of wanted to give that overarching view.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, to add to that as well, I mean, there's unintended consequences of the technology that we won't be able to define until it's put into play. And then those things will kind of pop out as we see it come out. So, Ted, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you some real world examples. So, for example, the school bus segment that we're working on, I think we can all agree that there are tremendous health benefits that come to actually having kids ride in electric buses versus diesel buses. It's very well documented that the worst place to be with respect to a school bus is inside a diesel school bus, because the kids are basically ingesting all those fumes. So there's a tangible health benefit, but how do you price it? The issue is those buses, as it stands now, the electric buses are 2 to 3 times more expensive than a conventional diesel bus. So how do you bridge that gap between a school, if a school district wants to come in and have a fleet of electric buses, you've got to actually bring in a finance solution. So here's a case where Nuvi can come in and bring investment capital, because our technology, when applied to that infrastructure, and when I'm talking about the infrastructure, it's the buses, the charging stations, the installation costs, the grid upgrades, all of that is a high capital cost. But it becomes financeable if you can apply a technology to it to earn additional cash flows that it wouldn't be able to earn on its own. So that's where Nuvi comes in. We enable that infrastructure with technology in order to make it financeable, so that you can actually bring that turnkey solution to school district, enable them to electrify sooner than they would otherwise be able to. So that's one case in point. Now, I'm going back to the ethics and back to the great company concept, where if we bring this to the frontier, where these stable grid infrastructures that we enjoy here in the developed world don't exist, then we become a great company, because we're enabling essentially places in the world that don't have the ability or access to a stable grid, so that people can live and study and learn and advance themselves. So we're working with the United Nations, and have been for years, to develop our technology in Africa. Have just completed a very successful project there with the UNDP, and the idea is to roll out our technology into their frontier market sites. so that these frontier markets get exposure to our technology. We can get in and execute on our process, because Nuvi is not just a technology company. We're a group of people executing a process repeatably and successfully in all regions throughout the world, where we work with stakeholders, establish a pilot, get data, show the data to the utilities and the regulators that are in those markets, establish interconnections, generate revenues, and then optimize for tax fees and tariffs. So that process is repeatable throughout any market, and we can go into the frontier as well and provide that stability that they need, so that they can have a much more much better access to a stable grid infrastructure.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, a changing environment for us, and I mean, a lot of positive that comes out of that, Ted. Through a couple of the answers you've given, we talked about the grid and, the stability of the grid, and obviously in other countries, it's a lot more unstable. And here in the United States, I mean, obviously we have a pretty stable grid. I'm based out of here in Austin. I know we did have some impacts to our grid a few months ago with the winter storms, and I'm originally out of Southern California, and you have some blackouts. We become more and more reliant on the grid and on energy. And as we talk about e-mobility and just other resources, whether that's cryptocurrency eating through electricity, what do you see as kind of opportunities and concerns as we become more reliant on electricity?
Is that for me or for?
Oh, sorry. Yes, for you, Ted.
Yeah. So look, for Nuvi, you can look at Nuvi as creating value where there's grid instability. And what I mean by that is, because we're able to aggregate those vehicles and provide services to the grid, the value for that actually goes up whenever there's instability in the grid. So Texas would be a great opportunity for us, because it also happens to be one of the top 5 school bus markets in the country. There's 500,000 school buses in North America, and Texas is a huge market. So imagine if you have a good portion of the fleet in Texas that's electrified, bidirectional capable, and aggregated with Nuvi's technology, we could provide services to the grid, resiliency, and if you put those buses in places where they can benefit disadvantaged communities, you also bring equity.
Yeah. What about concerns as we become more reliant on electricity?
Well, again, I think we can all agree that historically we've been very reliant and take for granted electricity, and we find that out whenever we have a public safety power shutoff or you have an event that occurs. Otherwise, we take for granted that when you flick the light, it's going to come on. So essentially, what you need. My concern with respect to Nuvi and Nuvi's technology is that as we scale, that from a regulatory and political standpoint, we will not have the tailwinds we need to actually scale into markets that need us dearly. Texas would be a prime example where we could use some help with respect to the interconnection regulations and the ability to actually bring our resources and monetize our resources when they're needed, and provide their kind of resiliency. So in a sense, I mean, I agree with Jigar Shah, who just recently left Generate to work at the Loan Programs Office in Washington, D.C. That it's to a large degree, these are policy and political decisions that need to be made.
Yeah. Bina, any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was going to say that, there is a saying that AI could save the world if it doesn't ruin the environment first. And a big factor is as AI usage grows, yeah, across all these industries, you see its energy consumption and carbon emissions are on top of mind. And there's a lot of work being done, whether it is through new processors and chips that's being developed to reduce that consumption. Right now, AI does consume a lot of energy, and it's part of it is because of the large volume of data and the complexity of the algorithms we run. And yeah, at this time, it does consume a lot of electricity, but I know there's a lot of work being done to mitigate that. I would also add that, having worked in the energy industry, I know AI is also being used in the AI in the energy industry, whether it is to, power grids, making the power grids smarter, right? Where you can actually time when the grids work to capture the most amount of power. AI can stabilize the power grid. For example, by detecting anomalies in the generation, consumption, or transmission in real time. Obviously, the side effect is it is by itself AI is consuming energy to be able to predict this, right? Then it's also used in electricity trading. In one of the projects that I worked on, we used AI to do better forecasting, so that so that you can do more optimal trading and control the reserves, right? To match the demand. It's definitely used in power plants and turbines, both from being able to predict how much energy would be captured, but also at what time is the most optimal time to capture that power. So I think we're seeing AI used as well in the energy sector to mitigate some of this, and there is also parallel efforts to reduce its own consumption of energy.
Yeah, Jason, I'll echo that, because for example, if you compare the benefits of AI with a technology like Nuvi's, and you can scale, you can basically integrate more electric vehicles into the grid more intelligently. You're essentially creating a multiplier effect to the benefit of having all these flexible loads and storage at the edge of the distribution grid where they're actually needed, and be able to integrate more wind and solar into the system, because you're in a sense buffering the volatility that those resources that are intermittent bring.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see the benefit of the combination of the two, and really to really amplify that green energy effect. Ted, you kind of talk about a little bit, I think you touched on this, but just, investments in infrastructure, under the Biden administration, obviously we see, the thought is coming down the pipeline is there's going to be substantial investment in infrastructure, technology, green energy. There's been a lot of talk of that, a lot of articles have been published on that. How do you see these investments coming through and impacting the sector, and what sectors do you kind of see them, impacting the most?
So, from a high level, you can look at what's happening with President Biden's green agenda. He's focusing on some specific things: fuel economy requirements, EV tax credits, charging infrastructure, trying to eliminate energy poverty, trying to clean up the grid, and then looking at financing the energy transition, and actually creating EV tax credits. One thing that you can see is that there's a Clean Commute for Kids Act that's specifically targeted towards the school bus segment. So they're looking at $25 billion over 10 years to help bridge that gap in the incremental cost of an electric school bus. And so Nuvi has historically been working with financing partners to bring turnkey solutions. Because there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure capital that wants to be deployed. Many of these infrastructure funds have a mandate to invest and deploy capital into sustainable infrastructure, which this is a part. So if you can show that this infrastructure can actually earn them a return, then you have a tremendous amount of infrastructure capital that can flow into this segment, which creates a lot of benefit. I mentioned Jigar Shah. He just moved from Generate Capital to the government loans program. That's a tell right there. That the government is serious. He would not have moved there if he thought it was going to waste his time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Bina, what are your thoughts on this and kind of the overlap with these investments in AI?
Yeah, I think it's a twofold, right? AI itself is being used to do some of the analysis and see, which investments have the most impact, right? You're definitely seeing the administration relying more on the technology to help make some of these decisions, but also then, how do you use these technologies to drive the actions, right? I'm also seeing more thought being put into it. Ted gave an example, but there are new roles being created. There are activity task forces and councils that are being set up to get more thoughtful. So I actually, for one, I'm very hopeful that we will see much more progress on this in the coming few years.
Yeah. So while we're on the topic of kind of government, and both of you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what do you see as kind of the regulatory and ethical concerns that we have in our present market, and what do you see coming down the pipeline with, ethical and regulatory kind of concerns? If you want to take that first.
Yeah, sure. So, there is a lot of what I'm seeing that is there is a lot of thought being put into the regulations and not just coming up with blanket regulations or policies for each technology, right? And which is the right approach to do it. As I said, AI is being used in so many industries and so many use cases. It is easy to say, let's just ban all kinds of this specific technology, facial recognition, for example. But I think for us to succeed in the long term, it has to be more nuanced than, banning one technology, right? It is to be more of, how is it relevant for this industry, for this use case, and what should be the regulation and policy around it. Just like, there are different regulatory organizations aligned within industries. Like you look at aviation, there is FAA. For healthcare, there's HIPAA, right? The rules are different. And I think when you think about AI as just a tool that's working in each of these industries, that rules has to be specific to that industry and within that industry for use case. The reason I share that is I do see this that through the task forces, through the committees, that's the level of thought that's being put into identifying and defining those regulations. The challenge to that is obviously it's going to take more time, right? And the other bigger challenge is you need to be tech savvy. You need to be aware of the implications of that technology to be able to come up with the policies and regulations. And that has been the gap in the past. But what I've seen in the past few months is really that appetite. And Ted's example was, perfect, right? Bringing in more alignment between the industry, between the commercial world, and how the technology is being used, and then partnering closely with the regulators to come up with those regulations. It's not regulators working in vacuum and bringing in just a couple of SMEs. We're seeing more and more of that collaboration happening between government and industry and academia as well to bring that robust policy in place. It'll take time, but I think that's the right approach instead of looking at just technology by itself in isolation.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And one of the things I think we'd all agree upon is that when you look at kind of the regulatory, process, that generally takes, like you said, a lot of time for that to be implemented. And so I think what you touch upon first is the ethical stance and the company's ethical requirement almost to touch on it first or to start to deal with it. So from an ethics standpoint, where do you see that the companies, technology companies, and especially in AI, what do you see as the obligation of these companies to do? Or
Yeah, I think the lack of a full understanding of what does ethics mean for an organization is a first step that needs to be addressed, right? Bringing in key stakeholders within an organization, because ethics is going to look very different based on how you're using AI or the technology, right? Like you think about healthcare as an example, right? Healthcare is a very broad industry, and whether if you're using AI for hospital bed management versus patient care versus medical insurance, those are completely different uses of the same technology, and the ethical implications are going to be different. Like from what I've seen the past few years, obviously the topic around the awareness around ethics is at everybody's aware of it. I think the next step is to get more nuanced about it. Because we hear a lot about fairness and bias in algorithms, which is absolutely important, but honestly, it's not as relevant to some industries and some use cases. Right? I have used AI for predicting machine failure on a factory floor in a manufacturing plant. When you're trying to predict a machine failure in a factory manufacturing plant, fairness and bias is really not an ethical factor. What's really important over there is the security, the reliability of the algorithms, and really the cultural transformation that needs to happen so the factory floor workers, the users actually using it, right? So that's, I think the conversation around ethics has to get beyond fairness and bias to let's think about all the ways this could go wrong and address it. And that's beginning to happen. And that's really coming also from the government. That's why, I think, we will see regulations coming out of this very thoughtfully.
Yeah, good comment, Dina. And I think you bring a interesting topic up too, is just overall adoption, right? There's a lot of times where technology is introduced and then you don't have adoption of that technology and it fails. Ted, anything else you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, a few things. So, I mean, just to point out, there's an inherent mismatch between early stage technologies and government policy, because we live in dog years, and policy changes in a glacial fashion.
Yep.
So you need to survive, and you need to have a business case that can survive that glacial process. You also need to be involved. We've always had a dedicated policy effort. One of the things I tell my engineers is shake hands with the policy people, because they're the ones that are paving the road for you to do the work you want to do. We have to be the ones that actually stand up, even though we're a very tiny company. We have to stand up and inform policymakers as to what we see and how we can bring value, and how, for example, with vehicle to grid, these vehicles can be intelligently integrated and provide the benefits that we need. As a society, we don't have unlimited resources. We have to do the best with what we have. And some things are just not on the table, like a complete redo of our grid infrastructure. What we have to do is we have to use new technologies to make those improvements at the right places at the right time, and forecast what the needs are, so that we can best bring stability and create value at the same time. So what I would say is it's important to understand what regulatory and policy changes are occurring, But at the same time, as an early stage technology company, you have to be very mindful of your runway and creating a business case with the environment that stands right now. Now we do have tailwinds in this environment. The policy is moving in our direction, but there's still a lot of regions that where we have to keep working at establishing that dialogue and making clear that a few words in current proposed language in these new regulations can make a tremendous difference. And so that there's a lot of effort going on there right now.
Yeah, great point, Ted. Maybe just one final question, and then we'll open this up to our audience. But coming out of the post-pandemic economy, what shift do you guys see in the technology industry, upcoming? Ted, you want to go first?
Well, we've lived through a lot, right? I mean, if you can just think back over the past 12 months or so, we've had the greatest pandemic in 102 years. We've had the greatest economic contraction in 80 years. We've had the greatest oil price decline ever. And we've had the greatest central bank and government intervention of all time. So things have been volatile. Some things have been compressed. This whole move to an online format has been difficult for many, but we've gotten through it. So I think in some ways we're increasing productivity, and that really is what disruptive technologies are about. I mean, we intersect an old line industry with a new technology, and you get transformation and disruption. So, if anything, my hope is that those transformations can be accepted quicker, and that we can boost our productivity, because that essentially is what keeps us on a steady path to growth.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I echo everything Ted said. I remember before the pandemic hit, a lot of conversation used to be around, use of technology and how it is really, really difficult for humans to stop getting addicted to technology. Or there was also resistance to, things like using technology with things like digital transformation. You had to justify why it was needed. What the pandemic has done is kind of, removed that whole discussion and shown that value. So it's accelerated the whole digital transformation path, the future of work. I don't think we are going to go back to the way we were, 15, 16 months ago. I think it has shown that humans can be equally productive, working remote sometimes, and it doesn't need to be, you don't have to justify it. So, right from where you work and how you work to more awareness around the need for digital technologies and why companies need it. I think it's just accelerated that whole journey we were on exponentially in the past few months. The other thing that, besides the pandemic, also, what I've seen is the conversation around inclusion and equity, becoming front and center, given all the incidents we've seen, right? It's something that, companies have kind of tried to work around, but the urgency and has now come into play, where there are goals being set, metrics being set for success on parameters that were not, at the forefront pre-pandemic era.
Yeah, I agree with both your guys' comments. It almost seems like, in my opinion too, at some points, if you look pre-pandemic, there was a lot of industries that were antiquated, and
Yeah.
And the technology really hadn't caught up to where it should have been. And I think this was an accelerator for us. And I think coming out of it, you'll see, continued, investment and growth in the technology industry. If anybody has any questions, please put them into the chat, and we can ask our panelists. I do have one here that says, how do we get regulators, policymakers to keep pace with AI to maximize the throughput and momentum of AI businesses? Ina, do you want to take that?
Yeah, and I'm smiling because do you really want regulations and policies coming out at the same speed as technology coming? If you think about the three different streams, right? The technology is still developing. We've not, got AI all packed and ready, and it's not developing anymore, right? And its applications are still developing. So I think, this will be an ongoing challenge for our generation and generations after us, because that innovation is continuing to happen. Where we can focus regulations is more on the application of technology. So, partnering more, bringing regulators and industries closer together, bringing in the SMEs together. That's the only way to, to try and keep pace. I don't think we will ever be at a point where you're seeing the technology innovation happening at the same time you see regulations coming out, within weeks' time, right? And I would actually hesitate to do that, because a lot of times we don't even know all the full implications of that technology, right? It's a different skill set that you need when you're building regulations versus when you're building technology. We are at this interesting time where you need to bring those two together, instead of thinking of, regulators can understand technology and solve for it. So I think you'll see more and more alignment between regulators and technologists, and more laws and guidelines coming at it, but at a much slower pace. From the real world, what I've seen is there are two approaches companies are taking from an AI ethics perspective. One is, really the chief digital officer or CIO say, I'm just setting out on my AI journey very early on. Tell me what are the guardrails I need to put in place so that my team can hit the ground running and innovate faster. So think about ethics upfront, and then put in the guardrails, whether it's designing the principles, or what are the ethical principles for the team, and what are the guardrails we need to put in place, thinking about it upfront so that the team can innovate faster. And the second one is more, where most companies are who have been using AI, is what are the guardrails, how do we play catch up? So we see both scenarios. Now you think about this is what's happening in the real world, right? They are still, trying to use this new technology, and regulators have to now come in and start thinking about what do the regulations and policies look like. And that's why you'll see a lot of it, coming in as these two groups come together. We also are dealing with the whole nuance of the global presence of this technology, right? And that's why you've all probably heard about EU's proposal around AI regulations, that has been published now, but it's going to take a while before it becomes regulation, right? And really, if you are a global company, how does it impact based on where you do business? I think this is the biggest challenge of our generation to figure that out. So hopefully, Solomon, I answered your question, or at least gave you some food for thought.
Thanks, Veena. Well, if there's no other questions, I will turn this back over to Tyler. Ted, Veena, thank you for your input. Thank you for attending today. Tyler, back to you.
And thank you guys very much for joining us. Everyone, if you want to stick around, we've got networking coming up. And I also want to let you know about the final in this series is going to be on June 10th at 10 a.m. We should have registration links going out soon, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.